There are very few topics that generate so much um, heat and so little light as the status of women in Islam.
That's for sure.
If you're trying to get a quick but, a thorough understanding, you just went straight into this wall of media narratives, cultural practices. It feels impossible to untangle.
It really does.
And the questions are constant. The headscarf, equality, fundamental rights.
And that is the perfect setup for this deep dive. Our listeners shared sources that we have to look past all of that, past the cultural stuff, and judge Islam on its core guidance.
The source material itself.
Exactly. So our mission here is to analyze the rights, the empowerment, and the legal framework that were given to women directly through the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. We're using those primary claims as our blueprint.
And the sources provide some pretty critical context right at the start to set a baseline.
Yeah.
They assert that before this guidance came, women were, profoundly subjugated.
Treated as property in many cases.
Literally inherited when a man died. So in this view, the introduction of the new guidance was a revolution. It brought legal autonomy, equality and spiritual reward, and foundational freedoms.
A complete paradigm shift.
Okay, so let's unpack that timeline of specific rights, because that's where the historical comparison really gets interesting. Let's start with education.
Yeah, this is one of those historical nuggets that really shifts your perspective. The material we reviewed claims that Islam made education obligatory for both males and females.
Obligatory, not just like permitted.
Obligatory,
Yeah.
a mandatory religious duty for everyone. And this was back in the 7th century.
And when you contrast that mandatory right with what was happening in other parts of the world, the timeline is genuinely stark.
It really is.
If you look at Western history, women in the United States, for example, they struggled for access to advanced learning. They didn't win the right to higher education, to actually attend universities and graduate until 1844.
1844. So you're talking about a right established in the 7th century versus one achieved in the mid-19th. The gap is huge.
It's massive.
And what's fascinating is how that obligation immediately translated into action. We're not talking about some slow theoretical change.
Right.
Our sources point to this remarkable specific fact. It's confirmed by both the Guinness Book of World Records and by UNESCO.
Okay.
The foundation of the oldest, continuously operating university in the entire world, the University of Al-Qarawiyyin
In Morocco, right?
in Fez, Morocco, in 859 AD. It was laid by a Muslim woman wearing the hijab, Fatima al-Fihri.
That's powerful. So a veiled woman is essentially launching the world's longest-running academic institution. And this is less than 250 years after the faith was even founded.
It just underscores how practically that educational mandate was prioritized. The environment was enabling, not restrictive when it came to learning.
And you see a similar timeline with property rights.
Absolutely. We see the same revolutionary timeline when we move directly to the right to own property. Islam established the right for women to own, manage, and dispose of property and wealth, completely separate from their husbands. Again, 7th century.
So her legal identity was distinct from his financial identity, even in marriage.
Precisely. And to understand how radical that was, you have to look at the laws that existed elsewhere for centuries.
Like English common law.
Yes, under English common law, you had the doctrine of coverture. It basically meant that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was just subsumed by her husband's. She couldn't sign contracts, sue, or own property in her own name.
And the sources give a specific U.S. example for that.
They do. They specify that in the U.S., white married women in Illinois, for instance, only legally won the right to own property separate from their husband in 1861.
1861. So if you're looking at just the legal history, you're observing a 13th century gap.
A 13th century legal gap. It fundamentally challenges the conventional timeline of progress we so often hear about.
It really does. So that historical comparison is the entry point. But let's shift focus to the family sphere, to economic and legal autonomy, because this is where the structure of financial rights really challenges that second-class misconception.
Let's talk inheritance.
Inheritance laws, yeah. They're so often cited as proof of inequality because women typically receive half the share of men.
Right, that's the common criticism you hear.
But if we connect this to the legal structure laid out in the material, that half share is entirely contingent upon a 100% financial obligation placed on the man.
Okay, unpack that relationship for us.
Right.
Why is the split linked to mandatory spending?
So the guidance establishes that the man carries the absolute legally enforced financial responsibility for the entire family. Food, housing, clothing, upkeep for his wife, his children,
Everything.
everything. Meanwhile, the woman, and this is the key, regardless of her own personal wealth or income, has zero mandatory financial responsibility for the home. Zero. Any money she earns or inherits is hers, purely her own, to keep, to invest, to spend on herself however she wants.
So the argument from the sources is that the man gets more because he is instantly obligated to spend it on other people, while her share, even if it's half the size, is essentially net profit for her.
Exactly. It's framed as a structural division of financial duty, not a statement about her worth. It guarantees her financial security while placing the economic burden squarely on the husband.
And the material contrasts this with earlier laws.
It does, yeah. It notes that in the Old Testament, for example, if a father had sons, the daughter usually received zero inheritance. Islam guaranteed women a share in multiple roles, as wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters.
And speaking of that kind of legal autonomy,
Yeah.
this practical approach, it extends to divorce as well.
Yeah.
The sources highlight the woman's right to initiate divorce, which is known as khula.
Correct. Khula is the legal mechanism where a wife can seek a separation. The material argues that Islam provided this because, well, it's practical. It acknowledges that sometimes marriages fail.
So there has to be an exit.
There has to be an avenue for independence if a relationship is harmful or just not working. And again, this right is claimed to be, absent or extremely limited in many earlier legal frameworks.
Okay, so we've established these historical rights, property, financial structure, but let's address the most immediate contemporary critique, which usually focuses on social laws. Modesty and the headscarf, the hijab,
Yeah.
is the presentation of it as oppression accurate, according to this material?
The material tackles this head-on. The logic it presents is that wearing the hijab is an aspect of decency and modesty, just like wearing clothes in general.
Okay.
But the legislation for it comes from the creator rather than being left to, subjective cultural trends that change every decade. The argument is, if society needs modesty laws, shouldn't they come from the source that knows what's best for social stability?
So it's framed as an objective requirement for decency and social order, not a restriction imposed by man on women.
Exactly. The obligation for women to dress modestly is explicitly stated in the source text. But, and this is crucial, the material stresses that modesty laws are comprehensive. They apply to males, too.
And that's the balance that always seems to get lost in the public conversation. So what does that modesty obligation look like for men?
It's often called the modesty of the eyes. Men are commanded not just to dress modestly themselves, but very specifically not to stare at or lust after women.
So the responsibility is on him to control his gaze.
It's a primary responsibility. The source material argues this is paramount in creating an environment where women are respected as people, not objectified. If men fulfill that commandment, the social pressure on women, it diminishes significantly.
That deeper context is essential.
Yeah.
And the sources also emphasize that the head covering itself isn't unique to Islam. It has really deep roots in other Abrahamic traditions.
Oh, it absolutely does. When we looked into the research, several comparisons came up. Jewish married women, traditionally, they cannot show their hair. And even more strikingly, the source points to Christian scripture, specifically 1 Corinthians chapter 11. The verses, as interpreted by this material, say that if a Christian woman shows her hair, it's a dishonor, as if she had to shave her hair.
Wow. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, is often held up as the role model for this.
Yes, for chastity, for modesty. And they even include a modern anecdote, noting that Christian women from the Amish church confirm they wear their covering because they believe their Bible commands it. The point being made is this isn't some alien concept. It's a foundational standard of modesty across major faiths.
Okay, let's try to connect all these ideas. Structure, responsibility, legal guidance, to the final and maybe the most controversial topic, polygamy. This is what external critics really seize on, seeing it as inherently unequal.
Right, and when analyzing the pre-Islamic context, the material claims it was effectively unlimited polygamy, no structure, no accountability, no financial responsibility.
A free-for-all, basically.
Pretty much. So Islam came and strictly limited it to a maximum of 4, but it came with this extremely high bar condition. But if you cannot do justice, marry only one.
That contingency on justice seems to be the entire mechanism. What does the guidance say that justice must entail?
The sources stress it means absolute equality in the tangible things. Equal lodging, equal provision of clothing, food, even equal time spent.
That sounds incredibly difficult to actually achieve.
It's incredibly stringent, and if a man fails, the consequences are severe, including punishment on the day of judgment. Because that requirement is so difficult, the source notes that while polygamy is permitted, it remains quite rare in practice.
So the structure is almost designed to limit the practice and to ensure fairness if it is undertaken.
Exactly. And again, the sources draw these comparative parallels. They note that almost every prophet cited in the Old Testament, Abraham, Moses, David, was polygamous. The material argues God didn't prohibit or restrict it in the Old Testament, and nor did Jesus.
And the sources contrast this restricted, legally structured permission with contemporary social realities.
Yes, they do. They cite surveys, like one from the Chicago Tribune, suggesting a high percentage of married men in the U.S. have extramarital affairs. They're basically engaging in unstructured, secret infidelity.
So the argument is that a legal structure, even one allowing multiple spouses under strict equitable conditions, is presented as being preferable to widespread, unrestricted deceit.
That's precisely the argument. That structured responsibility creates more fairness and transparency than cultural norms that enable widespread infidelity with zero legal or financial protection for the other people involved.
That is a very comprehensive look at what these sources claim regarding rights: education, property, financial independence, the right to initiate divorce, and a legal structure for marriage based on this idea of strict justice.
And the material insists that the measure of the faith has to be this core guidance, not the ways people deviate from it.
Right. And if we look at the impact of that guidance, the material offers a really striking data point to back up this claim of empowerment.
They cite specific figures. They suggest that when non-Muslim women actually investigate the rights and the empowerment in the Islamic structure, they're converting in significant numbers.
The numbers they cite are close to 18,000 non-Muslim women in the U.S. and 5,000 in the U.K. converting every year. That statistic is used to suggest these rights are seen as beneficial, not oppressive, by those who study them.
It ties the theoretical guidance directly to real-world reception. The source material emphasizes, that these foundational rights like education, independent property ownership were legally established in the 7th century. That's 13 centuries before many similar Western legal advancements.
Which brings us to the final thought for you, the listener.
Right. And it's an important question to consider. If these fundamental social rights were guaranteed and operationalized so early, back in the 7th century, how should we calibrate our understanding of societal progress and the source of ethical and legal guidance today? What stands out to you when you really consider that historical timeline?
That is the essential thought to take away. Thank you for guiding us through the depths of this complex material.
My pleasure.
We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer, faster, and more informed perspective. We'll see you next time.